Hi and welcome to this fourth video in the series about analysis of movement, and today we're going to be looking at squats and press-ups. And so with squats, what we look at is in two phases, the up and the down phase. And so the plane that it's moving through again is the sagittal and the axis is the transverse. And so very much like jumping, there's certain muscles and there's certain joints involved. And so the standing up phase of squatting, at this point the hip is extended, and the agonist at this point is the gluteals, and this will be undergoing an isotonic concentric contraction. The knee is an extension, and so the quadriceps are the main agonist there, and so obviously that's a concentric contraction as well. And the ankle is undergoing plantar flexion that you can see there, and the agonist is the gastrocnemius. The other muscles, the antagonists involved there, so for the hip, that would be the hip flexor, and for the knee, that would be the hamstrings, and for the ankle, that would be the anterior tibialis. Now, how sitting down is different. In the majority of cases that we've looked at previously, they've all been concentric contractions, and that's when it's being shortened. Now, you get an eccentric contraction when it works against gravity, so this is things like squatting and going on the way down. And so normally when the hip is in flexion, the muscle that controls that motion is not the gluteals, but it's the hip flexor. Now at this point, because the motion is working effectively against gravity at this point, and because obviously you're squatting down and you're having to do work against gravity, then the main agonist at this point is the gluteals. The knee, which is undergoing flexion, the agonist at this point is the quadriceps, and so the muscle at this point, this is an eccentric contraction, so both the gluteals and the quadriceps, because they're having to do work against gravity, they're lengthening, and so that's why it's an eccentric contraction. The ankle is in dorsiflexion, and the main agonist for that will be the gastrocnemius. So normally you would expect, if the knee was in flexion, that's caused by the hamstrings, but because that's having to do work against gravity, because you're having to support the weight of the person effectively working against the gravity, then essentially it's the other muscle that you would expect being the main agonist. So at this point, at the hip it's the gluteals, at the knee it's the quads, and at the ankle it's the gastrocnemius. Now the final motion you're meant to know about is press-ups, and again, like all of the other activities, it moves through the sagittal plane and it pivots around the transverse axis. Now we can divide the press-ups into two phases. The upward phase, and so at this point what's happening is the elbow is effectively straightening, and so the main agonist there is the tricep, and that undergoes a concentric contraction. The shoulder is undergoing horizontal flexion, and the main agonist at this point is the pectorals, so those are the muscles around the chest. Now on the downward phase it's slightly different. If you think about the squat, when you're going downwards you're actually working against gravity, and this is exactly the same on the downward phase of a press up, and so we can think of the contraction being eccentric. So obviously as you're going downwards on the press up, then the elbow is under flexion. Now normally when the elbow is under flexion we think of that being controlled by the bicep, but because you're working against the gravity here, the main agonist is the tricep at this point. The shoulder is undergoing horizontal extension, and we normally would expect, if the shoulder muscle is undergoing that type of movement, the extension, you would expect that to be the muscle to be responsible for that to be the ones found on the back. So that will be the anterior deltoid, and it will also be the latissimus dorsi. But because you're working against gravity, the main agonist is the pectorals, and not the muscles on the back as you would expect.